September 12, 1945. Nakodka Bay, Primorsky Krai, Soviet Far East. Corporal Masaru Tanaka stood on the grit-coated deck of a small transport ship as the winch clattered and the gangway fell to the pier. He counted the men around him by habit, lips moving without sound, palms pressed to the seam of his trousers as if formation still mattered. The air smelled of wet wood and coal smoke. The bay was busy with craft that moved like beetles across a puddle, barges and small steamers and longboats that shuttled prisoners toward the railhead. Tanaka's stomach cramped and then eased, a slow tide of hunger that had been with him since the last weeks in Manchuria. He had been a storehouse corporal in the Kwantung Army, a careful man who knew the difference between a full ration and a promise, and his mind was already measuring what he saw. There were barrels on the pier bound in rusted iron. There were sacks stacked under tarpaulin that sagged with damp. There was a small shed near the waterline where a thin plume of steam rose from the roof. He lifted a hand to shield his eyes and saw a line of narrow-gauge cars waiting inland, a locomotive sighing as it idled. He felt the weight of the old field notebook in his tunic, the paper soft from years of sweat and rain. He had written in it on the night of the surrender, and again in the holding yard at Mudanjiang, where Red Army guards with fur hats and canvas coats had counted them by the thousand and waved them forward with mittened hands. He had written one sentence then, and he mouthed it now. Do not wait for food. Make food from what they leave behind. The line moved, boots on metal, metal on wood, men stepping down to the pier in pairs. The Soviet sergeant on the gangway shouted in clipped Russian that even Tanaka's poor ear could follow. Move. Keep moving. Hands out of pockets. No talking. He felt the deck shiver as more men shifted toward the exit, and he felt the old return of calm that had served him in China and in the hot summer garrisons before that. Hunger became a problem to be solved. Water became a thing to boil. Waste became a resource. He kept his eyes on the barrels and the sacks and the small shed that steamed, and he began to plan. That same week, ships from Dairen and from ports along the Liaodong Peninsula were landing thousands of Japanese soldiers at Nakodka for transfer by rail to camps along the Ussuri and the Amur and across the Great Curve of Siberia. Soviet records compiled later would list more than 570,000 Japanese prisoners sent to the interior between August and the end of the year, with train manifests that showed strings of freight cars moving through Khabarovsk, Chita, Irkutsk, Krasnoyarsk, and Omsk. Some trains went still farther, into the mining districts near Magadan and across the frozen rivers that fed the Sea of Okhotsk. The camps were managed by the main directorate for prisoners of war and internees under the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, with quotas for timber and coal and construction labor measured in cubic meters and tons per day. Winter temperatures in Khabarovsk fell to 30 below zero on some mornings. In the taiga farther north, the cold cut deeper. The Red Army had moved fast in August, crossing the Amur and the Argun, sweeping across Manchuria with more than 1 million men, 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and thousands of aircraft. The Japanese armies had been broken in days. Surrendering soldiers handed over Arasaka rifles and bayonets and grenades, and then the process began. Count, sort, march, load, roll west. Rations on the rail journey were issued from a set table that favored bread and cabbage and a thin soup of barley that did not meet the expectations of men who had learned to stretch rice with millet and sweet potato. Letters written later by former prisoners describe the same scene at Nakodka. Long lines, tired men, damp fog sweeping across the bay by late afternoon, a smell of yeast and fish and coal. The numbers would matter in the months to come, because they shaped the rules of the camps and the choices of men like Tanaka. When 500 men were sent to a logging site with a fixed daily quota and a fixed daily ration of black bread, potatoes when available, and a ladle of soup, any improvement in survival had to come from within those limits. The official ration in many sites was under 3,000 calories in summer and sometimes under 2,000 in winter when the supply faltered. That grew worse when the bread ran out for a week or when the potatoes froze in storage. The death toll that would be recorded in Japanese and Russian sources decades later ranges from 50,000 to 60,000 across the entire internment period. The arithmetic behind those losses was relentless. Cold, work, hunger, disease, morale. The men who lived found margins wherever they could. They were sent inland the next morning on a mixed freight that creaked and shuddered uphill toward Khabarovsk. Tanaka sat on the rough floor of the boxcar with 30 others, his back to the wall, his knees drawn up tight. The car smelled of old grain and rope and damp wood. He looked at the men around him, and he noted the faces that belonged to cooks and clerks and farmers. He had learned to see those things quickly. The short man with a scar on his chin holding his hands away from the stove had a way with knives. The boy who had wrapped his scarf around his head and sat with eyes closed moved his lips like a man who prayed over pots. The tall man from Kagoshima with the broken front tooth had farmer's hands and a farmer's patience. When the stove at the end of the car burned down toward embers, he moved and held his hands near, and then closed his palms to hold the little heat and moved back to his place. The guards shouted for silence when men spoke. Tanaka did not speak. He watched the stove and the way the heat went up against the roof and the way the air moved above it, and he remembered a storeroom in Changchun where a cook had sprouted beans for a sick officer by placing a bucket near the kitchen flue. Heat and moisture and a little darkness. He flexed his fingers and reached into his tunic for his notebook and traced with one nail the old measurements he had copied there. 2 days for barley. 3 days for wheat. Keep damp but not flooded. Wash twice a day. Do not let mold take hold. He slept in snatches and woke whenever the guards opened the sliding door to hand in buckets of water or to pull out an iron bin for waste. When the train stopped at a way station named Vyazemskoye, men were made to stand in line for soup and bread. The soup held cabbage leaves and a few barley grains, and the bread had a thick crust that stuck to the teeth. Tanaka chewed and studied the platform. Soviet soldiers smoked and laughed near a stack of sacks that were stamped with a red star and a string of letters. Russian. He did not need to read the letters to see the shape under the cloth. Grain in roughly milled form, perhaps destined for a nearby unit or for a flour mill. There were also barrels with wire hoops near the kitchen shed. The smell of brine slid down the platform when the wind shifted. Sauerkraut. The knowledge settled on him like an old cloak. The guards would not feed them more because they asked. They would feed them better if the work went better. The work would go better if the men stood straighter and moved faster. And that meant more calories and more salt and some vitamins that the soup did not provide. He could make some of that appear from things that no one valued much. He chewed the last mouthful of bread and half choked it down, and then tucked the dry scrape of crust into his cheek to soften it. He would need twine and a cloth, and a space where the heat rose. He would need the cooperation of the men who cleaned the stove ash. He would need to bargain without words for the water bucket to sit near the stove between the scheduled washings. He could do those things. By winter, several trains a day were still moving through the same junctions and the same gray valleys to the same broad rivers and then across them into the forest country. The camp in which Tanaka's group ended up lay west of Khabarovsk, inside a stand of larch and birch close to a narrow river that moved slow under the first skin of ice in October. Later accounts by men who might have been in that region describe barracks built in lines, 12 by 60-foot frames of wood with single stoves at the center, plank bunks in 2 tiers, and a single window at either end. The standard is easy to imagine because NKVD files from other camps show the same pattern. A compound fence of boards and wire. Watch towers at the corners. A gate with a small guardhouse. A kitchen shed and a bathhouse, and a sick barrack where the smell of camphor and iodine mixed with stale smoke. The work party assigned to Tanaka's barrack was made up of 100 men detailed to logging. The quota stood at several cubic meters of timber per man per day, measured by tallies on a board and by the piles near the skid road. The ration was fixed against that quota. Bread in the morning and at night. Soup at midday and again at night if the kitchen had enough to go around. Potatoes when the store held. Cabbage often. A spoon of fish when a barrel arrived by sled. A cup of watery Kysel on Sundays, if the kitchen worker felt kind. In that setting, the difference between a man who wasted peelings and a man who used them was the difference between 5 more kilos of body weight in December and a bed in the sick barrack by January. Diaries smuggled back to Japan later tell the same story in simple lines. Frost. Axes ringing in the wood like bells. Hands cracked to blood. A man who says he will save his bread for later and then eats it early when the smell of soup becomes a rope that pulls. Another man who trades half his bread for a bit of salt. Another who becomes silent and does not rise when the whistle blows. The numbers behind those sentences are plain. Malnutrition begins with a few weeks of thin rations and hard labor. Deficiencies of thiamine and vitamin C show up as weakness and sores, and then as heart failure in the cold. A quarter of the sick in a bad winter might present with edema and fatigue so heavy that even a few steps feel like miles. The men who survived learned tricks that look small on the page and large in the stomach. They sprouted grain to produce vitamin C. They boiled pine needles and added the sap-flavored water to soup. They scraped the last fat from the inside of barrels and stirred it into the pot. They found the cabbage leaves that had fallen in the snow outside the kitchen door and shook the ice and dirt off and brought them in and chopped them fine. In that setting, a storehouse corporal with calm eyes and a notebook could make a difference that would show up in the spring roll call. The first night in the barrack, Tanaka moved slow and polite and did the work of a man who wanted no trouble. He unpacked the 2 torn blankets and folded them along the length of the bunk to make a thicker strip that would support the spine. He asked the man with farmer's hands his hometown, and when he heard Kagoshima he nodded and said that he had eaten sweet potato there once while traveling with a supply column. He offered to take the first turn at cleaning ash from the stove, and when he lifted the iron lid, he felt the pattern of heat inside the brick with the back of his hand and judged the draft. He brought the ash pan to the door and tilted it and watched how the ash fell and how last night's cook had banked the coals for a quick relight in the morning. He wrapped the pan with both hands and felt a small flick of pride as he did not spill a single cinder. When he had finished, he looked around the room and found the corner where damp boots and coats had been hung. The air, there was warmer and moister than in the center. He could hang a cloth there with a few stones tied to the corners, and he could set a shallow box near the stove leg to stay warm. He spoke to the quiet man with the wrapped scarf and asked if he had ever sprouted barley at home in winter. The man lifted his eyes and said his mother had done it when he was a boy. He described the smell, sweet and green, and made a small gesture with his fingers, as if rubbing two seeds together. That was enough. Tanaka reached under his tunic and took out the notebook and tore a small square from the last page and wrote 4 characters: water, wash, warmth, watch. He folded the square and slid it under the iron leg of the stove where it would not blow away when the door opened. That night he asked the kitchen worker for the sack sweepings that would otherwise go in the waste. He received a snort and a shrug, and no answer. The next morning he brought the same worker the stove ash packed tight in a rusty tin with a rag to carry it. And he showed him how the ash would help scrub the worst grease from a pot without tearing the soft hands that had to work in warm water. The worker grunted and set the tin aside, and a few hours later he called to the barrack door and held up a handful of gritty barley tails that had spilled in the storeroom. Tanaka lifted both hands and bowed, then moved among his own men and issued tasks. 2 to bring a shallow crate from the pile behind the kitchen shed. 1 to cut a square from an old blanket under his bunk. 1 to watch the stove after lights out and add a bit of wood to keep the corner warm during the first hours of sleep. He rinsed the grain in a bucket and poured off husks and dirt, and then set the cleaned seeds on the cloth in the crate and sprinkled water by hand until the cloth was damp and shining. He set the crate on flat stones near the stove leg and tied the blanket to a beam to make a curtain to hold a little steam. When the guard came in to check for lights, he said nothing. He only looked for contraband. He saw a neat crate and a folded cloth and a clean floor, and went out into the cold again. By the end of the 3rd day, small white nubs appeared on the barley. By the 5th day, the sprouts lay like thin green grass on the cloth. The room smelled faintly of earth and a clean sweetness that cut through the smell of wet wool and smoke. Tanaka lifted a handful and chewed and felt the small crack of sweetness spread across his tongue. The men watched and then reached for their own handfuls. He stopped them with a hand and a look, and then counted out a small measure for each, and told them to chew slow and swallow, and then drink a little warm water. He set aside the rest for the pot. He lifted the lid on the stew that had been set to simmer, cabbage leaves and a few potatoes and a scrap of fish, and he stirred and then added a part of the sprouts and waited, and then added a little more, and then waited again. He did this with care, because he knew that a quick boil would destroy what he was trying to deliver. Warmth below a simmer would soften the sprouts without erasing what made them precious. He ladled the soup into the tin cups and watched as the men drank and then held the cups in both hands to warm their fingers. That night, the barracks slept better. They woke with less ache in the joints. The difference was small, not a miracle, not a feast. But it was a move in the right direction. He used the same method with wheat when he could get it, and with peas when the kitchen man brought him a few. He asked the men who worked on the wood-cutting detail to collect pine needles from the nearest trees on their way back, and he showed them how to crush the needles in a cloth and steep them in hot water to make a brew that smelled like the forest. He laughed softly when one man made a face at the taste, then told him to pinch his nose and drink and think of spring. He took the greasy scrape from the bottom of a barrel and set it to melt in a small tin, and then stirred it into the evening pot. He made a point of handing the first cup to the weakest man. The barrack watched and followed his cue. He built a quiet order around food, and he kept the rules simple. Wait your turn. Chew slow. Save a bit before sleep. Drink hot water when you can. Share a little with the man who carried your saw when your hands failed. The guards did not interfere because work improved. The daily pile grew, The tally board showed numbers that kept the kitchen in a better mood. A corporal in a foreign camp did not command with rank, but he could command with a steady hand and a clear plan. He knew that too. The camp system around him moved on its own schedule, heavy and impersonal. Rail cars arrived at the small siding near the camp with coal and flour and barrels of pickled cabbage, and then with nothing for a week, and then with more than the kitchen could use before it spoiled. Prison labor was tallied in days and tons rather than faces and names, and sick men were moved to the infirmary, where a Russian feldherr with tired eyes and steady fingers worked with limited supplies. In Khabarovsk, the number of registered Japanese prisoners grew by the week. In Irkutsk and Chita and Krasnoyarsk, the same columns rose. The overall death rate across the system would be tallied later at under 1 man in 10, lower than some rumors and higher than others. But those numbers do not show the way a man stared at his bread before he bit it, or the way he limped to the latrine and returned with his eyes closed. For an older audience, the truth sits best in simple words. Many were cold. Many were hungry. Some did not return. The men who did return often told the story of one small trick that made a difference. A handful of sprouted grain, warm soup with a green taste, a brew of pine needles that put a little life back in the mouth. They spoke of a man in their barrack who kept his voice low and his rules plain. In letters, preserved in small-town museums in Japan, you can still read lines like these. We learned to eat slowly. We learned to keep a spoon of soup for the last minutes before sleep. We learned to save peelings and not to throw anything away if it would boil soft. We learned to lean on one another without shame. Some letters mention a name. Some only say a corporal with a notebook. In the spring, when the river broke and the ice moved downstream in slow sheets, the men in that barrack stood a little straighter at roll call, and when work parties were formed for the next site, the guard with the red scarf around his neck pointed at their group and said a word that crossed the language without effort. Strong. The thaw came slow, beginning in the last days of April 1946, when the river that had lain silent since November began to move under its crust of ice. Tanaka stood near the bank one morning and watched the water push black ridges through the surface. The sound was low and constant, a heavy murmur that carried through the air and under the ground alike. He could smell soil again. The snow around the camp fence had thinned to a gray slush, and the birch trees that lined the far hill carried beads of water that shone like glass. His hands were cracked and his nails had split, but his legs held him steady. Each morning the guards shouted the same roll call, counting in broken Japanese numbers, and each morning the men answered in a rhythm that no longer sounded like defeat. The work detail now walked 2 kilometers to the cutting site instead of 1, and they carried saws that bit faster through thawing wood. Tanaka still led his small group from the front, counting in his head the men who coughed too often or stumbled on the path. The crate of sprouted barley now had a permanent place by the stove, protected by an old tin lid that rattled when someone brushed against it. He had learned to rotate the batches so one tray was always ready to eat and one just starting. The flavor no longer surprised them, but the effect remained clear. Fewer men collapsed during work. The sick recovered sooner from sores. Even the Russian feldherr, who at first had regarded the operation as superstition, began sending weak patients to Tanaka's barrack for soup. Beyond the camp, history moved with the same slow rhythm of thaw. The war had been over for 8 months, but its aftershocks continued across the Soviet Union and Asia. In Manchuria, Soviet divisions were dismantling Japanese factories and rail lines for shipment home. In Korea, American and Soviet occupation zones were drawing lines that would harden into borders. In Japan, the first wave of repatriation ships had begun bringing home civilians and soldiers from China and the Pacific Islands. But the men taken into Soviet custody were not among them. Their numbers were too large, their labor too valuable, and their political use too convenient. Official statements spoke of temporary internment for the purpose of reconstruction. But for the men in the camps, the meaning was simple. They would work until the state said otherwise. The NKVD's Central Records Office in Moscow issued monthly reports to the Council of Ministers, showing tonnage of timber and coal extracted by Japanese labor. In March 1946, Japanese prisoners in the Far Eastern camps had produced over 400,000 cubic meters of timber. Coal mines near Kemerovo and Magadan added another 200,000 tons that month alone. The Soviet economy was rebuilding from the ashes of its own devastation, and the manpower represented by those captured soldiers filled a crucial gap. The guards understood this even if they never spoke of it. They knew the quotas, they knew the pressure from Moscow, and they knew that healthier prisoners meant higher output. Tanaka understood the same equation. Every handful of sprouted grain, every pine needle brew, every warm stove at night served not only his comrades, but also the invisible machine that measured their worth in tons and cubic meters. In May, the camp commander changed. The new man was Captain Ivanov, a veteran of Stalingrad with a limp and a gray scar that ran down his cheek. He wore his greatcoat even in mild weather and smoked thin cigarettes that left a faint smell of tar in the air. His first week in command, he ordered an inspection of all barracks. When he entered Tanaka's, the prisoners stood at attention, while the interpreter explained that this was the captain responsible for work quotas and rations. Ivanov looked around the room, noting the neat bunks, the clean floor, and the crate by the stove. He lifted the lid and frowned at the sight of the sprouts. The interpreter hesitated, uncertain whether to explain. Tanaka took a small step forward, bowed, and said in slow, careful Russian the words he had learned from the guards: "Food for health." The captain stared for a moment, then nodded once. He turned to the interpreter and spoke quietly. The next morning, 2 guards arrived with a burlap sack of barley sweepings and left them without comment. That week, the kitchen added an extra ladle of soup for Tanaka's barrack. Word spread fast across the camp. Men from other barracks came to ask questions, some whispering, some open. Tanaka showed them the process, writing with a piece of charcoal on a wallboard. Rinse, soak, cover, keep warm. Soon half the camp was sprouting grain in boxes, and the smell of green filled the air even above the smoke and damp wool. The change reached the commanders. Sick lists grew shorter, output rose, and for the first time since arrival, the guards spoke without shouting. A letter sent by a Soviet medical officer to Khabarovsk that June noted the improvement. The Japanese prisoners have discovered a method of supplementing vitamins through the germination of grain. Mortality has decreased. Productivity has improved by 15%. The phrasing was bureaucratic, but behind it lay the quiet miracle of survival. By midsummer, the forest turned soft and green, and the camp's rhythm shifted with the season. Work began earlier to escape the heat. Men returned in the evening with the smell of sap and sweat heavy on their clothes. Mosquitoes filled the air, and the smoke from the campfires mixed with their constant whine. Tanaka spent his hours between shifts maintaining the sprout crates and organizing a system to dry pine needles for winter use. He instructed the men to collect resin when they cut trees and to save it in small lumps that could be burned for warmth or traded with guards for salt. The quiet man who had once wrapped his scarf around his head became the unofficial keeper of the sprouts, checking the moisture each morning with a practiced touch. The farmer from Kagoshima built wooden slats to raise the boxes off the floor so the heat could circulate evenly. These small changes carried significance beyond their size. They gave the men a sense of control, a way to push back against the uncertainty of captivity. Every new crate built, every handful of grain saved for sprouting, was an act of defiance against hunger. The guards tolerated it because their own reports improved. By September, the camp's output was the highest in the region. The commander received a commendation, the guards received extra bread rations, and the prisoners received small privileges, longer rest breaks, permission to keep firewood near the barracks, an extra ladle of soup on Sundays. In the evenings, Tanaka would sit by the window and write in his notebook, noting the date, the temperature, and the count of men still fit for work. His handwriting had grown shaky, but his mind remained clear. "We eat green and live," he wrote one night. "It is simple. The seeds live first, then we live after." By October 1946, frost returned to the camp and the river froze again, sealing the narrow valley under a white sheet that cracked at noon and glittered under the moonlight. Tanaka's breath came out in small clouds as he walked to the worksite each morning, his boots crunching in rhythm with 100 others. The forest stood silent, except for the thud of axes and the groan of falling trees. He had lost weight again, but the light in his eyes remained sharp. The sprout crates now stood along one side of the barrack, elevated on stones to keep them from the damp floor. They were part of daily life, tended by habit. The process had become routine. Soak grain in warm water at night, drain at dawn, rinse at midday, turn by evening. When the stove went out for inspection, the men covered the boxes with blankets to hold the warmth. The faint green smell filled the room even when the temperature outside dropped below freezing. It was a smell of life in a place built to hold despair. During that winter, the number of prisoners in the Soviet Far East peaked at more than 200,000, spread across dozens of camps from Khabarovsk to the Lena River. Many worked on construction sites for railways, sawmills, or military installations. Official NKVD bulletins noted that discipline and morale among Japanese prisoners remained satisfactory. Behind those words lay countless small acts of endurance like those in Tanaka's camp. Illness still came with the cold, and men still died, but the worst hunger had eased. The simple act of sprouting grain provided vitamins that prevented scurvy and other deficiencies. Soviet camp doctors began reporting improved resistance among Japanese labor units, a phrase that hid the human details. In one report from Irkutsk, a medical officer wrote, "The prisoners have discovered a method to enrich the ration naturally. Mortality has decreased by nearly half compared to the previous winter." Those improvements were not miracles, but arithmetic. More strength meant more work meant more food, and the cycle fed itself. In January 1947, Captain Ivanov summoned Tanaka to the command hut. The interpreter told him to bring the notebook. The captain sat behind a desk piled with papers and ration lists, a kerosene lamp burning low beside him. He looked at Tanaka for a long time before speaking. "You organize the food," he said through the interpreter. "The men work better because of you." Tanaka bowed and waited. Ivanov continued, "You will teach other camps." For a moment, Tanaka did not understand. The interpreter explained that a small group of prisoners would travel under guard to nearby camps to demonstrate the sprouting method. It was not a reward, merely an order, but it meant travel and the chance to see beyond the fence. That week, he left with 3 others and 2 guards on a truck that rumbled along the frozen river road. They passed villages where smoke rose from chimneys and children played on sleds. They saw peasants chopping ice for water, their faces red with cold. In each camp they visited, Tanaka repeated the same demonstration. He showed how to soak and rinse, how to keep the grain warm, how to avoid mold. He spoke little, letting his hands and the results speak for him. The guards watched without comment, and the prisoners watched with hope. One Russian officer asked why he did it. Tanaka answered softly through the interpreter, "Because it keeps men alive." By spring, the practice had spread through much of the Far Eastern camp system. Soviet officers called it the Japanese method in their reports, noting its efficiency in maintaining health with minimal cost. In some camps, they issued orders requiring every barrack to maintain a sprouting crate. For Tanaka, this recognition brought no privileges, only heavier responsibility. He returned to his camp to find his own barrack cleaner, the men stronger, and the mood changed. They still longed for home, but the tone of waiting had softened. Letters from repatriated soldiers began to reach them through official channels. Some told of ruined cities and ration lines in Japan. Others spoke of family farms barely surviving on government aid. The news filled the men with mixed feelings. They had imagined home as salvation, yet it too was struggling. The realization deepened their resolve to live and return with dignity. That summer, Tanaka resumed his old duties as quartermaster of the barrack, still recording daily observations in his notebook. His entries from June 1947 show precise lines of numbers. Work party 96 men, absent sick 5, output 48 cubic meters, sprouts sufficient, morale stable. His handwriting remained neat, each character drawn as if it might matter later. Autumn 1947 arrived with a dry wind that rattled through the birch trees and carried the first hints of frost down from the hills. Tanaka woke each morning before the whistle, a habit he could not break. He sat at the edge of his bunk and rubbed his palms together until the stiffness left his fingers. The barrack had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible 2 years before. The walls were patched and sealed, the stove lined with new bricks, and the sprout crates arranged neatly on a wooden shelf that ran the length of the wall. The air smelled faintly of grain, smoke, and pine resin. Men spoke in low voices, no longer from fear, but from the quiet rhythm of work. Tanaka still carried his notebook tucked under his tunic, its edges frayed, but its pages full. He recorded every small detail, the weather, the quantity of grain received, the number of men in the infirmary, the thickness of the ice on the river. These records were not for the guards, nor for himself alone. He believed that someone, somewhere, would one day need to know how they had lived and what had kept them alive. Across the Soviet Union, the vast system of Japanese prisoner camps was slowly contracting. Repatriation had begun in small waves, first for the sick and wounded, then for older men. By late 1947, nearly 100,000 prisoners had been returned to Japan through Nakodka and Vladivostok, boarding ships of the U.S. and Soviet fleets under the supervision of international observers. But the strongest and most able-bodied men remained behind. The Soviet government still required their labor. They worked in mines near Chita, in sawmills along the Angara River, and on construction sites where new power stations rose from frozen ground. The internal reports of the Ministry of Internal Affairs listed their output with bureaucratic precision. 900,000 cubic meters of timber in the fourth quarter of 1947, 120,000 tons of coal, thousands of cubic meters of stone for new rail lines. For the men in the camps, these numbers were invisible, but the work that produced them filled every waking hour. Tanaka's group still cut wood and hauled it to the riverbank, stacking it in neat piles for measurement. Each log was counted, each day noted. He reminded the men to eat small portions through the day, to chew slowly, to drink whenever they could. Their strength was no longer only a matter of survival. It had become a statement of endurance, proof that discipline could outlast captivity. One evening, near the end of November, a Soviet truck arrived at the camp gate. The guards shouted for the prisoners to line up. A supply convoy had come from Khabarovsk, bringing salt, flour, and several sacks of barley. When the sacks were unloaded, the driver, a young Russian with a red scarf, called to the interpreter and pointed toward the barrack. Tanaka stepped forward. The interpreter said the man had heard about the Japanese who made the green food and had brought extra barley for the next season. The gesture was simple, but it rippled through the camp. The guards and prisoners shared a brief understanding that crossed the boundary between them. That night, Tanaka walked to the stove, stirred the coals, and wrote a single line in his notebook. The seed of kindness grows as surely as the barley. In the following weeks, he distributed small measures of grain to each barrack, instructing the men to begin soaking it for the next batch. Even in the deepening cold, the sprouts grew, pale and fragile, but alive. Outside the fences, the world was beginning to shift. The Tokyo trials were concluding, and news of convictions filtered slowly through Soviet papers. In Japan, American occupation forces were rebuilding cities and industries, introducing new constitutions and elections. Families of the prisoners sent letters through the Red Cross, uncertain if they would reach their destinations. Tanaka received one in January 1948, a thin envelope smudged by travel. Inside was a letter from his wife, written in careful strokes on lined paper. She wrote of their daughter, now 8, and of the small vegetable plot behind the house that kept them through the rationing. "We eat barley and rice mixed," she wrote, "and I think of you every time I see the grain." He read the letter 3 times before folding it back into the envelope and placing it between the pages of his notebook. That night, he could not sleep. He sat by the stove and listened to the soft breathing of the men around him, thinking of the distance that still separated him from home. He did not cry, but the tears came later, quietly, when no one could see. Spring 1948 arrived later than usual, the snow clinging to the ground even as the sun climbed higher each day. The camp's wooden fences leaned under their own weight, their posts softened by 2 winters of frost and thaw. Tanaka woke to the call of crows outside the barrack window and knew by the sound of the river that the ice was breaking. He felt older, slower, yet still driven by the same steady sense of duty that had guided him since the first months of captivity. The sprouting crates now belonged to the camp itself. Every barrack had them, and new arrivals from other camps learned the method as part of their orientation. Tanaka's name had become a quiet legend, spoken with respect by prisoners and mentioned in NKVD health reports. But in his mind, it was never a legend. It was simply work, an extension of the same discipline he had carried as a soldier. Each evening, he still wrote in his notebook, though the pages were nearly filled. His entries now included not just the day's events, but short reflections. "To live each day is the victory," he wrote one night. "The sprout lives by turning darkness into growth. So must we." That spring, Soviet authorities began another phase of repatriation. Rumors spread that the next group to be released would come from the Khabarovsk region. Each day, men gathered near the gate, hoping to hear their names read aloud. A Red Cross representative visited in May, accompanied by Soviet officers who recorded lists of prisoners for transfer. The inspection brought tension and hope in equal measure. Tanaka's barrack was commended for exemplary hygiene and work discipline. The captain shook his hand before the visitors, a gesture that carried weight. But when the final lists were posted, Tanaka's name was not among them. He accepted the news quietly, though he could see disappointment in the faces around him. The men who were leaving came to him for advice: how to stay healthy on the journey, what to expect when they reached home. He told them to take sprouting grain with them, to teach others. "This is not mine," he said, tapping the edge of the crate. "It belongs to all who need it." On the morning of their departure, he stood by the fence as trucks carried the first group toward the rail line. A few men raised their hands in silent farewell. He bowed in return, then turned back toward the barrack and began sorting the grain for the next day's batch. Outside the camp, the shape of the world continued to change. Japan had begun to rebuild under the Allied occupation. New factories rose from the ruins, railways reopened, and food supplies slowly improved. The government created a repatriation bureau to handle returning prisoners, estimating that nearly 500,000 remained scattered across the Soviet Union, China, and Mongolia. In Moscow, diplomatic negotiations with American and Japanese representatives discussed the gradual release of the remaining men. But progress was slow. Soviet records showed 575 camps in operation, each contributing labor to industries critical for post-war recovery. Timber quotas remained high, and the need for workers delayed repatriation indefinitely. Tanaka's camp, now officially numbered 721V, produced over 50,000 cubic meters of lumber that year. He continued leading his section, teaching new arrivals how to work safely with axes and saws, how to protect their hands from frostbite, and how to stretch a ration to last the day. The guards treated him with a cautious respect. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a symbol of order in a place that had long thrived on chaos. In December 1948, an inspector from Khabarovsk arrived unexpectedly. He toured the camp, checking reports and inventories, and spoke briefly with Tanaka through an interpreter. "You were in Manchuria?" the man asked. Tanaka nodded. "You served under the 124th Infantry?" Again, a nod. The inspector took notes and said only, "Your name is recorded." A month later, word came that another group would leave in the spring. This time, Tanaka's name appeared on the list. When the notice was read aloud, the barrack erupted in cheers. He felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet relief. That night, he opened his notebook and read back through its pages. Every line of data, every temperature and tally, every small observation of hunger and survival. He tore out one sheet, the one that held the sprouting instructions, and handed it to the youngest man in the barrack. "Keep this," he said. "You will still need it here." The next morning, the guards called his name at roll call for transfer. He packed his few belongings, the notebook, his wife's letter, a small pouch of grain, and stepped into the pale morning light. As the truck carried him down the same frozen road he had once traveled under guard, The fences of the camp faded behind him. Ahead lay the long road to Vladivostok, and beyond it, home. The train journey to Vladivostok lasted 11 days. The cars were old passenger coaches lined with frost inside the windows, but compared to the boxcars of his capture years earlier, they felt almost like home. Tanaka sat among hundreds of men, each carrying a small bundle, each quiet in his own thoughts. At every station, guards distributed thin soup and bread. They passed Khabarovsk, Birobidzhan, and countless nameless sidings where Russian workers waved from the platforms. The vastness of the land stunned him anew. Endless forests rolled past the window, broken by frozen rivers and distant smoke from factories that had risen since the war. The same industrial power that had consumed them now seemed to hum with a quieter rhythm of recovery. Tanaka watched and wrote in his notebook, his hand trembling with cold and age. "So much land," he wrote. "So many men to rebuild what war destroyed. The earth never rests." When they finally reached Vladivostok, the air smelled of salt and oil. The port was alive with cranes, trucks, and the metallic ring of shipyards. Thousands of prisoners from other camps were already assembled in fenced compounds near the docks, waiting for transport. Loudspeakers crackled with Russian orders, and lists of names were called in Japanese translation. Tanaka's group was assigned to Barrack 12 near the harbor's edge. From there, he could see the masts of ships and the gray sweep of the sea. For days they waited, undergoing medical checks and paperwork. Each man was photographed, measured, and issued a small identification slip stamped "Repatriation, Japan." The Soviet clerks worked efficiently, their faces expressionless. The atmosphere buzzed with tension and disbelief. Some prisoners feared they might be redirected to new labor sites, while others whispered prayers of thanks. Tanaka kept to himself, sharing small portions of sprouted grain he had managed to bring along. Word of the barley man followed him even there. One Soviet medic, hearing the story from an interpreter, smiled and said, "You gave your men life. That is worth more than medals." Tanaka bowed deeply. It was the first time since his capture that a Russian had spoken to him with such warmth. On the morning of May 24, 1949, Tanaka's group was ordered to prepare for embarkation. The prisoners lined up in columns, each man carrying his small pack, while Soviet officers checked names against lists. The docks were crowded with ships, rusted freighters converted for transport. Tanaka's ship was the Kasan, a former supply vessel now painted white with a red cross on its funnel. As he climbed the gangway, he looked once more toward the city. The cranes moved slowly, lifting cargo for the rebuilding of a nation he would never see again. He thought of the camps scattered across Siberia, of the men still waiting, and of the small green sprouts that now grew in boxes in hundreds of barracks. The journey across the Sea of Japan took 4 days. The weather was calm, and the men were allowed on deck for air. They stood in silence, watching gulls circle above them, each bird a reminder of freedom. On the third night, a faint outline appeared on the horizon, mountains rising through the mist. It was Japan. Tanaka gripped the railing until his knuckles whitened. He could smell the sea change as they neared the coast, salt mixed with the faint scent of pine carried from the shore. They landed at Maizuru, the primary port for returning prisoners. The scene was orderly and solemn. Medical officers from the Japanese Red Cross greeted them with disinfectant sprays, blankets, and rice balls wrapped in paper. Some men fell to their knees, weeping. Others stared in disbelief at the sight of Japanese writing on signs and uniforms. Tanaka felt dizzy as he stepped onto the dock. His legs trembled from exhaustion, and for a moment he feared he might collapse. A young nurse caught his arm and guided him toward the examination tent. Her voice was gentle, like wind through leaves. Inside, he received a small card marked "Returned POW, May 1949. It listed his camp number and place of origin. Khabarovsk region, USSR. He carried it like a relic. After the medical check, he sat on the dock eating slowly, savoring the soft rice. The taste brought tears he did not expect. Nearby, loudspeakers announced transport destinations: Tokyo, Osaka, Kagoshima. He wrote one final note in his book. Home soil after 4 years. The seed that lived in darkness has reached the sun. The train from Maizuru to Kagoshima took 2 days. It was crowded with men in worn uniforms, their faces lean but alive. The countryside slid past in flashes of green and gray, a patchwork of rice paddies, ruined stations, and towns slowly returning to life. Tanaka sat by the window, his notebook resting on his knees, watching Japan unfold like a memory half forgotten. The houses looked smaller than he remembered. The fields, once neat and full of workers, now lay empty in places, waiting for hands that had not yet returned. Children waved at the passing train, some barefoot, some carrying buckets of water. At each stop, volunteers handed out tea and rice balls, bowing deeply to the returning men. When the train reached Kagoshima, he felt a lump rise in his throat. The volcanic cone of Sakurajima stood across the bay, its slopes dusted with smoke. He had seen that outline in his dreams during the long Siberian winters. The moment felt unreal. He stepped onto the platform slowly, clutching his small pack as if afraid it might vanish. His village lay several kilometers inland, past the low hills and narrow roads that wound between farms. He walked the final stretch on foot. The path smelled of wet earth and plum blossoms. Old neighbors came out of their houses when they saw him, their faces breaking into cautious smiles. "Tanaka-san," they said softly, as if unsure the name still belonged to a living man. He bowed and continued toward his home, a small wooden house near the river. The garden fence was still standing, though the wood had weathered gray. The door slid open before he could knock. His wife stood there, thinner than he remembered, her hair streaked with white, her hands trembling. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she stepped forward and touched his sleeve, as though confirming that he was real. Their daughter, now nearly 10, peeked from behind her mother, holding a small bowl of barley grains. "We planted them," she said. "They grow fast." Tanaka smiled for the first time in years. He knelt and took the bowl in his hands, staring at the pale shoots pushing through the soil. "Yes," he said softly. "They always do." In the months that followed, life resumed its quiet rhythm. The government offered returning prisoners small stipends and assistance finding work. Tanaka joined a cooperative sawmill in town, where he used his knowledge of timber cutting learned in the Soviet forests. He spoke little of the camps, preferring to spend evenings in the garden, tending to the barley that his daughter had planted. The sprouts became a family symbol, a reminder of endurance. Sometimes local teachers invited him to speak to students about his experiences. He would bring his old notebook, its pages yellowed and torn, and read short passages in a calm, even voice. "We lived because we learned," he would say. "The earth gives enough when men are patient." His listeners often expected stories of cruelty, but he spoke instead of discipline, cooperation, and the small acts of kindness that had kept his comrades alive. "We were soldiers once," he told them, "but we survived as farmers." His story spread quietly through Kagoshima and beyond. Newspapers published brief accounts of the barley method and how it had saved countless lives in the camps of Siberia. Researchers confirmed its effect, linking sprouted grain to vitamin preservation. Tanaka's simple trick became part of Japan's post-war memory, cited in health journals and repatriate testimonies alike. By the time he grew old, the world had changed again. Japan's cities were rebuilt, its factories humming, its people prosperous. The scars of war faded, though they never disappeared entirely. In 1975, the local History Society organized a small exhibition on wartime experiences. They displayed Tanaka's notebook in a glass case, open to the page where he had written his first note about the sprouts. He attended the ceremony quietly, sitting in the back. When the curator asked if he wished to speak, he declined. "The book speaks enough," he said. After the event, a young student approached him and asked what had kept him alive through so much hardship. Tanaka thought for a moment and replied, "Because life is stubborn. Like grain in darkness, it searches for light." He died a few years later, in his sleep, surrounded by his family. On his grave, his daughter placed a small wooden bowl filled with barley sprouts, green and trembling in the morning air. They grew quickly, as they always had, their roots reaching down into the soil of a land reborn. The story of his quiet invention, carried by those who had lived because of it, became a symbol of resilience not only for Japan, but for all who had endured captivity and refused to surrender to despair. His name faded from official records, but the green shoots lived on, silent proof that even in the darkest places, life finds a way to rise again.